What's the debt ceiling and why is Congress being dumb about it? Let's talk about that. Hello, everyone. My name is Andy Yardley. I'm a U.S. history teacher out of Arkansas, and today we're going to be talking about the United States debt ceiling. So, if you've been paying any attention to the news, or maybe you haven't, and you just kind of live under a rock, the U.S. is going to default on their loans, which, in any case of any type of loan, it sounds and is really, really bad. But in today's episode, I want to talk about how we got from where we were, which did not involve a debt ceiling, to where we are now and why so many people are arguing about what to do with our debt ceiling. So let's get into it. Basically, the very beginning of the United States, 1788 or 1789 if you're looking at the Constitution, or however far back you want to go, the United States has always been a capitalist type of economy. The markets decide everything, which the markets being us or other buyers, investors, sellers, and consumers. And we've based our entire economic system and financial institutions on the principles of Adam Smith's capitalism. For the United States government, that comes down to one really big important part of our Constitution, the first article of that Constitution. You see, Article 1 of the United States Constitution is all of the rules, powers, and regulations of the legislative branch of the U.S. government. So the House of Representatives, the Senate, and anything that involves the legislative branch. That's anything from taxes, declaring war, and most importantly, what to do with public money and those tax revenue collected, and what the Congress can and cannot do with that money. So, under Article 1, it is Congress's job, more specifically the House, but also still needs approval from the Senate. It is Congress's job to deal with any and all of our debts and investments as a government institution. So that involves loans, creation of bonds from the Treasury Department, currency, minting new and legitimate type of paper or physical money, and all of that is done through the legislative branch of our government. From 1788 to about 1916, the Congress was a little bit limited in what and how it dealt with our money, and limited in a way that not so much that they couldn't do anything, it was just a more tedious process. From 1788 to about 1916, the U.S. government had to sit down as a Congress and talk about how many bonds, how much currency, and how many debts that they were going to have or procure during that fiscal session of the United States. Every bond and every financial issue had to be talked about on the Congress floor, and they had to set a specific number that they were allowed to make for bonds and currency for that fiscal year of the United States. And yes, it was a very tedious process. Every year, both houses had to come and sit and discuss how many bonds that they were going to make for the Treasury, if they needed to print more money, how much gold was in the coffers, all those different things. This process of the Congress coming and approving every single bond issue for the United States was known as just the Liberty Bond Act. Congress had to come and sit and do all this other stuff that aforementioned, and again, it was kind of a tedious process. And they did that from 1788 to about 1917. However, things changed in 1917. We were kind of in the midst of World War I, and Congress came up with the idea to change how we did all of our bonds, debts, and other financial system parts of the United States government by creating the Second Liberty Bond Act, which instead of approving everything under a set amount, they basically created a debt ceiling, where we get the term, to where they could issue as many bonds, as many loans as they needed, just so long as they fell under that ceiling. Since 1917, that is kind of the economic system that the United States has had when it comes to loans, bonds, and our debt. We set amount for it, and so long as it is within that ceiling, then the United States is typically okay. After the passing of the initial Second Liberty Bond Act, Congress also saw the good that this could potentially have, setting a specific limit that can be raised or lowered over the years depending on how much money the United States needed or wanted to spend on certain pieces of financial legislation. Fast forward a few more years to about 1939, all the way through the end of World War II, Congress consistently started raising that debt limit. From 1939 all the way up to 1945, the debt limit went from about $120 billion to about $300 billion. After World War II, they decided to lower the debt limit to about $275 billion, which it stayed well through the Korean War. This time period is known as the Public Debt Acts. Basically, they would pass these legislations to say, oh, we need to borrow more money, or no, we've borrowed enough, maybe we need to lower the amount that we actually have. And for the most part, our debt stayed relatively consistent. Tried to stay as much under that ceiling as possible, paying only what we need, and paying off everything as quickly as we possibly could. And for those few decades, it was a relatively okay system, with us keeping the debt relatively low compared to our GDP and how much we were bringing in as a country in terms of money. It stayed that way, again, up until the end of the Korean War. So let's fast forward in time a couple more decades to the 1970s. This is where things really start to get a little hairy for the United States in terms of money. This takes place in 1974, and a couple years prior, you had the Watergate scandal with Richard Nixon, and you had other people coming into power that were trying to figure out whether or not the United States actually needed the debt ceiling. In 1974, the Congress came together. One of the members that dealt with the budget, known as James Sorowski, he believed that the debt ceiling actually outlived its usefulness and that there were better ways to deal with U.S. debt, and actually wanted to reform the process. However, 1979, there were a few members of Congress that saw the potential for a default. In 79, a Democrat out of Missouri known as Dick Gephart introduced the Gephart Rule. And this rule basically stated that every time that Congress passed a new budget, they had to either raise or lower the debt ceiling to meet and match with that budget. He believed that a default was possible in the United States government, and this rule was to try to kind of combat against a potential default, which unfortunately is where we're at today here in the United States. So over time, basically since the end of the Korean War to now, our deficit and debt ceiling have sharply been increasing almost every 5 to 10 years or so. Throughout our American history, we've had several debt crises that have almost resulted in catastrophic failure of our economic system. There was one in 1995 where it actually resulted in a lowering of the federal government and kind of decreasing its size, which at the time was seen as a good thing. Then again in 2011, where our debt ceiling reached $16 trillion, and Republicans in Congress at the time used this as a leverage to try to bring down the deficit as much as it could. There's also a financial problem with the debt ceiling in 2013, again in 2021, and now in our day and age in 2023. The debt ceiling is a serious issue. There's a lot of problems that can come from the United States defaulting on its bonds and loans that it owes, not only to us, the American people, but also to the countries that invest into the United States economy. So now I kind of want to put our debt ceiling into perspective of just how much it's gone up over the years. We've been keeping track of kind of the debt ceiling since about 1940, and every year from 1940 it has gone increasingly up to when we first hit $1 trillion in the 1980s, all the way up to now to where we're in about $16.4 trillion for our debt ceiling. There's been an exponential growth of our debts and what we set each year for our debt ceiling that has and will probably continue to cause problems both now and in the future if something isn't done to try to get the debt under control. To kind of just let you guys know just how much it has changed since 1940, we had a debt of about $40 billion and now we're sitting on a giant bubble of $31.4 trillion. Yes, that's trillion with a T. So let's do a quick recap. How did we get to such a huge ballooned type of deficit from where we are to where we were of having such a low amount of debt that we could have easily have paid off from 1940 to about 2023? It starts off with, again, the Liberty Bonds Act from 1788 that went all the way up to 1917, where Congress had to first approve every single bond that it wanted to issue for that fiscal year. And it stayed like that for about 130, 120 years. We had that system of doing things with our financial system. Congress setting a specific limit that it was only allowed to make. Then in 1917 to our present day, switching over to the debt ceiling model, where we just kept increasing our debt ceiling relative to the amount of money we had in our budget. The debt ceiling is a very confusing economic term that not a whole lot of people know what, how, or why we have or continue to have the system where it keeps presenting this problem of reaching our deficit and potentially not being able to pay off our bills, which seems to be happening more often as time goes on. Again, from the last time that we had a debt ceiling crisis, or the first time I should say, was 1995, and we didn't have another one until 2011, and then again in 2021, 10 years later, and then only 2 years later with 2023. So with the debt ceiling, something does have to change. Either we have to start lowering our deficit, we have to stop expanding the size of the federal government, or more unpopularly, we may have to start raising taxes in order to start paying off more of this debt that we've accrued over the decades. And there you have it, just kind of a brief history of how we got to where we got to with the U.S. debt ceiling, and hopefully this video helped explain a little bit more about how the debt ceiling has grown and have been affected over time. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment down below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that bell notification to get notified for all of my latest videos. And if you are just as worried about the debt ceiling as I am, don't forget to stay tuned, because I will do a video on what will be affected with the United States government if we do default on our loans. So stay tuned for that video as well. Well, until next time, have a great summer, have a great day, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.